On January 8, 1863, at a muddy ceremony in Sacramento, California, a crowd gathered to watch Governor Leland Stanford drive a ceremonial silver spike into a railroad tie. The Central Pacific Railroad was officially beginning construction. The goal was audacious to the point of insanity: build a railroad east from Sacramento, across the Flat Valley, up and over the Sierra Nevada mountains, through Nevada, and across the desert to meet the Union Pacific Railroad building west from Omaha. The two lines would connect somewhere in the middle, creating the first transcontinental railroad, a continuous line of iron spanning the entire width of the United States. The Union Pacific had the easier route: flat prairie, wide open terrain, some hills but nothing impossible. The Central Pacific had the Sierra Nevada, a wall of granite 7,000 feet high, covered in snow for 8 months of the year, with slopes so steep that a man standing upright had to lean forward to keep from falling backward. There were no passes at the right elevation, no natural routes. The railroad would have to be carved into the mountains using hand tools, black powder, and human labor. And the men who would do that work, who would chip tunnels through solid rock and build trestles over canyons that had no bottom, were Chinese immigrants, Irish laborers, and a scattering of Civil War veterans who had survived one kind of hell and were about to enter another. Between 1863 and 1869, these men would move more rock and dirt than had been moved in any construction project in American history to that point. And they would build over 1,000 miles of railroad through terrain that engineers said was impossible. And they would do it without engines, without machinery, without bulldozers or excavators or any of the equipment we associate with construction today. Just shovels, pickaxes, wheelbarrows, black powder, and hands that bled until they calloused into leather. This is the story of how America built the Transcontinental Railroad. Not the sanitized version. Not the narrative of visionary industrialists and nation building. The ground truth. The men who froze to death in snow tunnels. The ones who were blown apart by premature explosions. The ones whose names were never recorded and whose graves, if they have graves, are unmarked cuts in the Sierra granite. This is about scale, suffering, and the kind of work that reshapes a continent one shovelful of dirt at a time. Let's start with what they were up against. The Sierra Nevada is a granite batholith, a massive intrusion of igneous rock that cooled and solidified millions of years ago. It's not sedimentary stone that you can chip away with a pickaxe. It's granite, dense, crystalline, harder than most steel. A man swinging a sledgehammer against Sierra granite could work all day and make a dent measured in inches. And the Central Pacific didn't need inches. They needed tunnels. 15 tunnels, some of them over 1,600 feet long, cut through solid rock at elevations above 7,000 feet. The longest, the Summit Tunnel, would have to be bored through 1,659 feet of granite at an elevation where snow fell from October through May, and temperatures dropped to 20 below zero. The engineers knew it was possible in theory. Tunnels had been built through mountains before, in Europe, using similar methods, but those projects had taken decades. The Central Pacific didn't have decades. They had investors who wanted returns. They had competition from the Union Pacific, and they had a federal charter that paid them per mile of completed track. The faster they built, the more money they made. So the engineers, led by a man named Theodore Judah, and later by the chief engineer Samuel Montague, came up with a plan. Hire as many men as possible, work around the clock, and accept that some of them would die. The men who stood on springboards and felled 300-foot redwoods didn't have anyone documenting their work. The Chinese laborers who chipped through a mile of granite with hand tools didn't either. But you're here now, watching their story unfold. If you believe the impossible things our ancestors achieved deserve to be remembered, if you think the people who built the infrastructure we still depend on matter, hit subscribe. This channel exists because people like you refuse to let history be forgotten. The men who laid these rails didn't expect monuments, but we can give them something better. We can make sure their story is told. The workforce began as a mix. Irish immigrants fleeing famine and looking for work, Civil War veterans, men who had survived Shiloh and Antietam and needed a job, drifters, miners who had gone bust in the goldfields. But the work was brutal and the pay, while decent, wasn't enough to keep men on the job. Workers would sign on, last a few weeks, and quit. By 1864, the Central Pacific was desperate for labor. That's when Charles Crocker, one of the Big Four investors and the man in charge of construction, made a decision that would define the project. He started hiring Chinese workers. There were thousands of Chinese immigrants in California, most of them veterans of the gold rush who had been pushed out of the mining camps by racial violence and restrictive laws. They worked in laundries, restaurants, and agriculture. They were paid less than white workers and had no legal protections. Crocker saw them as a resource. They were available. They were cheap. And despite the racist assumptions of the time, they turned out to be the best workers on the line. Within a year, the Central Pacific workforce was over 90% Chinese. At the peak of construction, more than 12,000 Chinese laborers were working on the railroad. They did the hardest, most dangerous work. They blasted the tunnels. They built the retaining walls. They graded the roadbed on slopes so steep that men worked roped together to keep from falling. And they did it for less money and in worse conditions than any white worker would accept. The tunnel work was where the real nightmare lived. Boring a tunnel through granite with 1860s technology was a process of unimaginable tedium and danger. There were no tunnel boring machines, no pneumatic drills. The method was simple and brutal. Drill holes in the rock face using hand drills. Pack the holes with black powder. Light the fuse. Run. Wait for the explosion. Clear the rubble. Repeat. A single round, one cycle of drilling, blasting, and clearing might advance the tunnel face by 18 inches, maybe 2 feet if the rock cooperated. The summit tunnel, 1,659 feet long, it was being attacked from both ends and from a central shaft sunk from above. Even working from 4 faces simultaneously, the progress was measured in feet per week. The drilling crews worked in teams of 3. One man held the steel drill, a long iron rod with a chisel tip. The other 2 swung sledgehammers in alternating rhythm. Strike, turn the drill a fraction, strike again, hour after hour. The noise in the confined space of the tunnel was deafening. The ringing of steel on steel echoed off the granite walls. The air was thick with rock dust that coated your lungs and left you coughing blood by the end of a shift. The men worked by candlelight or oil lamps. Ventilation was poor. The smoke from the lamps mixed with the dust and made it hard to breathe. And this was before the blasting. Once a series of holes had been drilled, and usually 6 to 10 holes per round, the blasting crew would take over. Black powder was packed into the holes using wooden tamping rods. A fuse was inserted. The fuses were cut to length based on how much time you needed to get clear, usually 60 to 90 seconds. But fuses were unpredictable. They could burn fast or slow. They could sputter out, or they could burn faster than expected. The blasting crew would light the fuses, starting with the ones farthest from the tunnel entrance, then work their way back, lighting each one in sequence. Then they ran, out of the tunnel, into the open air, and they waited for the explosions. The blasts were violent. The confined space of the tunnel amplified the shockwave. Even outside the tunnel, you could feel the concussion in your chest. Inside, if you were caught, the blast could rupture your lungs, shatter your eardrums, or bury you under tons of rock. Premature explosions killed men. A fuse burning faster than expected. A spark from a hammer strike igniting loose powder. In September 1866, a premature blast in the summit tunnel killed 4 Chinese workers instantly. Their bodies were buried under rubble. It took 2 days to dig them out. The company records listed them as Chinese laborers, names unknown. They were buried in a mass grave near the tunnel entrance. Work resumed the next day. After the blast, the clearing crews moved in. The rubble, broken rock, and granite fragments had to be removed before the next round of drilling could begin. This was done by hand, men with shovels and wheelbarrows. The rock was loaded into small carts, pushed out of the tunnel on temporary rails, and dumped over the side of the mountain. A single blast might produce 20 or 30 tons of rubble. All of it had to be cleared before progress could continue. The work was exhausting. Shovel, load, push, dump, repeat, shift after shift. The summit tunnel took over 2 years to complete. 2 years of round-the-clock work. 2 years of drilling, blasting, and clearing. And that was just one tunnel. There were 14 others, some shorter, some nearly as long. Each one required the same process, the same labor, the same risk. And the men doing this work were being paid $30 a month. That's about $1 a day. White workers were being paid $35 a month plus room and board. Chinese workers had to buy their own food. They lived in camps near the work sites, crude shelters built from scrap lumber and canvas. They cooked their own meals, usually rice and dried fish, over open fires. In the winter, when the snow was 20 feet deep, the camps were buried. The workers lived and worked in tunnels dug through the snow. Some of these snow tunnels collapsed, burying men alive. The bodies weren't recovered until spring. The winter of 1866 to 1867 was one of the worst on record. Snow fell continuously from November through March. At the summit, the snowpack reached 40 feet in places. Avalanches were constant. An avalanche didn't give warnings. One moment the snow was stable. The next, the entire slope was sliding, carrying men, equipment, and camps with it. In February 1867, an avalanche swept through a Chinese labor camp near the Donner Pass. The camp was gone in seconds, buried under 30 feet of compacted snow. The records are unclear on how many men were in the camp. Estimates range from 20 to 40. Their bodies were not recovered. When the snow melted in June, the remains were found scattered across the slope. They were buried where they were found. No markers, no names. But the work didn't stop. The Central Pacific kept pushing. More workers were brought in. The camps were rebuilt. The tunnels were advanced foot by foot. And slowly, impossibly, the railroad took shape. East of the summit, the terrain opened up. The work shifted from tunneling to grading. Grading meant creating a level roadbed for the tracks. In flat terrain, this was simple. You cleared the brush and laid the ties. But in the mountains and across Nevada, the terrain was anything but flat. The roadbed had to be cut into hillsides, built up across gullies, and bridged over canyons. Cutting a roadbed into a hillside was done with picks and shovels. A crew would mark the line of the grade. Then they would start digging. On the uphill side, they cut into the slope, removing dirt and rock to create a level shelf. On the downhill side, they built up a retaining wall using the excavated material. If the slope was steep, the retaining wall had to be reinforced with timber or stone to keep it from collapsing. The work was slow. A crew of 50 men might advance the grade by a few hundred feet in a day. And this was happening across hundreds of miles. The Chinese workers excelled at this kind of detailed, precise work. They built retaining walls that are still standing today, 150 years later. Dry stone walls, fitted together without mortar, designed to flex and settle without collapsing. They graded roadbeds on slopes where a misstep meant a fall of hundreds of feet. They worked roped together, belayed from above, chipping footholds into the rock and hauling material up and down, using pulleys and woven baskets. The methods they used were the same methods they had used building terraces in the mountains of southern China. They adapted those techniques to the Sierra Nevada, and they worked. On the flatlands of Nevada, the challenge was different. The terrain was desert, alkaline soil, no water, summer temperatures that exceeded 110 degrees. The workers, still predominantly Chinese, graded hundreds of miles of roadbed across this wasteland. They lived in temporary camps that moved with the work. Water had to be hauled in by wagon from distant wells. Food supplies came by wagon train from Sacramento, a journey that took weeks. The camps were brutal: dust storms, scorpions, rattlesnakes, and the heat. Men died from heat stroke, from dehydration, from accidents. The company didn't keep detailed records of the deaths. The number is unknown. Estimates based on scattered reports and later investigations suggest that over 1,000 Chinese workers died during the construction of the Central Pacific Line. Some from accidents, some from disease, some from exposure. Their graves, if they were buried, are lost. While the Central Pacific clawed its way east through the mountains, the Union Pacific was racing west across the plains. The Union Pacific had its own labor force, predominantly Irish immigrants, Civil War veterans, and freed slaves. Their challenges were different but no less brutal. The plains were flat, but they were also empty. No trees for timber, no stone for ballast. Everything had to be hauled in. The Native American tribes, the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Pawnee, saw the railroad as an invasion. They were right. The railroad brought settlers, soldiers, and buffalo hunters who would destroy the herds the tribes depended on. The tribes fought back. They raided work camps, tore up rails, and attacked supply trains. The Union Pacific hired guards, former soldiers, to protect the workers. The construction became a slow-moving war. The grading crews on the Union Pacific faced their own dangers: accidents with black powder, floods that washed out miles of roadbed, harsh winters on the high plains where temperatures dropped below zero and the wind cut through clothing like a blade. Men froze to death in their tents. Others died from disease, cholera, and dysentery spread through the camps, killing dozens. The company pushed forward. The competition with the Central Pacific was fierce. Every mile of track meant money, land grants from the federal government, and prestige. By 1868, both railroads were making rapid progress. The Central Pacific had cleared the Sierra Nevada and was laying track across Nevada at a rate of over a mile per day. The Union Pacific was pushing through Wyoming, heading toward Utah. The two lines were converging. The race to finish became a national spectacle. Newspapers covered it. Bets were placed on where the lines would meet. The workers, aware that the project was nearing completion, pushed harder. The Chinese crews on the Central Pacific set a record on April 28, 1869. In a single day, they laid 10 miles of track. 10 miles. That's over 3,000 ties placed, over 25,000 spikes driven, 50,000 pounds of rail lifted, positioned, and spiked down. The feat required coordination, speed, and endurance that seems impossible. But it happened. The record stood. The two railroads met at Promontory Summit, Utah on May 10, 1869. A crowd gathered, dignitaries from both companies, photographers, reporters. The ceremony featured speeches, handshakes, and the driving of a golden spike to symbolize the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. The photographs from that day show well-dressed men in suits posing in front of the locomotives. What the photographs don't show are the Chinese workers. They were not invited to the ceremony, despite having built more than half the Central Pacific line. Despite having done the hardest and most dangerous work, they were excluded. The official narrative erased them. The celebration belonged to the investors, the engineers, and the white workers. The Chinese went back to their camps, packed their tools, and dispersed. Most returned to California. Some stayed and found work maintaining the line. Others moved on to new construction projects. Their contribution was forgotten for decades. Yung Wing, Hung Hua, Chin Lin So. These are three of the very few names recorded of the thousands of Chinese workers who built the railroad. Most were listed only as Chinese laborers in company records. No first names, no ages, no hometowns. When they died, they were buried in mass graves, or their bodies were shipped back to China if families could afford it. The Central Pacific kept minimal records of these deaths. There was no legal requirement to report them, no oversight, no accountability. The men were expendable, and they knew it. If you think the memory of those men, the ones who blasted tunnels through granite and laid track across deserts, the ones whose names were never recorded but whose work is still carrying freight today, matters? Subscribe. Nobody was filming when they died in avalanches or premature explosions. No one documented their sacrifice. But we are now. You're helping make sure these men, Chinese, Irish, Black, are never forgotten. That's not just watching history. That's honoring it. The construction of the Transcontinental Railroad killed an estimated 1,500 to 2,000 workers. The exact number will never be known. The companies didn't keep comprehensive records. The graves are scattered across 1,000 miles of mountains, plains, and desert. Some are marked, most are not. The railroad they built changed the United States. It connected the coasts. It made travel that had taken 6 months by wagon possible in 6 days by train. It enabled the settlement of the West. It moved goods, people, and ideas faster than ever before, and it was built almost entirely by hand. The tools used to build the Transcontinental Railroad were simple: shovels, pickaxes, sledgehammers, wheelbarrows, hand drills, black powder, no steam shovels, no mechanical excavators. The first steam-powered construction equipment wouldn't appear for another decade. Everything, every cubic yard of dirt moved, every foot of tunnel blasted, every rail spike driven, was done by human muscle. The scale is staggering. Over 20 million cubic yards of earth were moved during the construction of the Central Pacific Line alone. That's enough to fill a trench 10 feet deep and 10 feet wide from San Francisco to New York. And it was moved one shovelful at a time. The engineering challenges were solved with ingenuity and brute force. The trestles, wooden bridges that carried the tracks over canyons and ravines, were built using timber hauled in from hundreds of miles away. The trestles were massive structures, some over 100 feet high, built on slopes where a misplaced timber could send the whole structure collapsing. The Chinese workers excelled at this. They built trestles that were architectural marvels, using mortise and tenon joints, wooden pegs, and hand-cut timbers. Many of these trestles were later replaced with stone or steel, but some of the original wooden structures stood for decades. The Summit Tunnel, the longest and most difficult tunnel on the Central Pacific Line, was finally completed in November 1867, after 2 years of continuous work. When the final blast broke through, connecting the east and west faces, the alignment was nearly perfect. The two bores started from opposite sides of the mountain and, guided only by surveying and mathematics, met with less than 2 inches of error over 1,659 feet. It was a triumph of engineering, and it was built by men working with hand drills and black powder. The human cost of that triumph was written in bodies. The Central Pacific estimated that over 1,000 Chinese workers died during the construction of the line. That's one death for roughly every mile of track. The Union Pacific's toll was lower, estimated at 400 to 500, but still significant. These were not random accidents. They were the result of pushing men to work faster than was safe, in conditions that were inherently dangerous, with no safety equipment and no oversight. The companies knew men would die. They accepted it as a cost of doing business. The workers had no choice. For the Chinese immigrants, the railroad was one of the few employers willing to hire them. Anti-Chinese sentiment was pervasive in California. They were excluded from most trades, barred from testifying in court, and subject to violence and discrimination. The railroad offered wages, however meager, and the possibility of survival. For the Irish workers on the Union Pacific, the situation was similar. Fleeing famine and prejudice, they took the work because there was nothing else. The freed slaves who worked on the line were escaping the sharecropping system of the post-Civil War South. The railroad was brutal, but it paid cash, and for men with no other options, that was enough. The legacy of the Transcontinental Railroad is complicated. It was an engineering marvel. It transformed the economy. It enabled the growth of cities, the expansion of agriculture, and the industrialization of the West. But it was also built on exploitation, on the labor of men who were treated as disposable, and on the destruction of Native American lands and ways of life. The railroad brought settlers who displaced the tribes. It brought buffalo hunters who slaughtered the herds to near extinction. It brought the end of a way of life that had existed for thousands of years. The tribes knew what the railroad meant. They fought it. They lost. The physical remnants of the construction are still visible. In the Sierra Nevada, you can hike to the sites of the old tunnels. Some are still in use, widened and reinforced, carrying modern freight. Others are abandoned, sealed off, slowly being reclaimed by the mountains. The roadbed, the graded shelf cut into the hillsides, is still there, overgrown with trees and brush, but recognizable to anyone who knows what to look for. The retaining walls, built by Chinese workers 150 years ago, are still standing, stones fitted so precisely that they haven't shifted. In Nevada and Utah, the old grade is visible from the air, a scar running across the desert, parallel to the modern tracks. The wooden ties have long since rotted. The rails were salvaged and reused, but the shape of the roadbed remains, and scattered along the line are the graves. Small markers in forgotten cemeteries, piles of stones in the desert, places where workers were buried where they fell and never moved. Some of these graves have been located and documented by historians and archaeologists. Most haven't. The photographs from the era, the ones that do exist, show the scale of the work. Images of Chinese workers standing in a tunnel, holding drills and hammers, their faces obscured by shadow and the limitations of early photography. Pictures of grading crews, dozens of men with shovels working a hillside, shots of the trestles under construction, timber frameworks rising out of canyons dwarfing the men who built them. These images are fragmentary, incomplete. They don't show the deaths, the suffering, the cold, the heat, the exhaustion, but they show the men. And that's something. Some of you have been here since the beginning. You're not just watching these stories. You're part of something bigger. If you want to go deeper, if you want early access to videos before anyone else sees them, if you want to be part of the tribe that keeps these stories alive and make sure the workers who built the infrastructure we still depend on are remembered, join the membership. It's for the people who don't just consume history. They carry it forward. The link is in the description. You'll get early access, research breakdowns, and you'll be supporting the work that makes these stories possible. Our members are the reason we can keep digging into archives, finding the forgotten laborers, the tunnel crews, the track gangs, and bringing their stories back to life. If you want to honor the legacy of the men who move mountains with shovels and hand drills, the membership is waiting below. The engineers who designed the Transcontinental Railroad are remembered. Theodore Judah, Grenville Dodge, their names are on plaques and monuments. The investors, the Big Four, Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, Charles Crocker, made fortunes and founded universities. Their names are on buildings across California. But the workers, the men who did the actual building, are mostly forgotten. There are a few monuments. In 2014, the U.S. Department of Labor inducted the Chinese railroad workers into the Labor Hall of Honor. A plaque was placed, speeches were made, but for over a century, their contribution was erased. Historians are working to recover the stories. Oral histories from descendants, company records, fragmentary and incomplete, that list work crews and casualties, archaeological work at the old campsites, uncovering artifacts, tools, personal items. Slowly, the picture is being filled in. But much is lost. The workers themselves, the ones who survived, rarely spoke about the experience. It was just work, hard, dangerous work. You did it, you survived, you moved on. There was no expectation of recognition or gratitude, and for over a century, there was none. The Transcontinental Railroad is still in use. The route has been modified, tunnels have been improved, grades have been eased. But the bones of the original line are still there. Freight trains carrying goods from the ports of California to the markets of the East still follow the path carved out by Chinese and Irish laborers in the 1860s. The infrastructure they built has been carrying commerce for over 150 years, and it was built without bulldozers, without excavators, without any of the machinery we consider essential for construction today. Just hand tools, black powder, and human labor pushed to the absolute limit of endurance. The men who built the Transcontinental Railroad didn't expect to be remembered. Most of them probably didn't think what they were doing was remarkable. It was a job. It paid. It was brutal and it was dangerous, but so was everything else available to men with no education, no capital, and no connections. They did the work because it needed doing, and they were the ones willing to do it. They moved millions of tons of rock and dirt. They blasted 15 tunnels through the Sierra Nevada. They graded a roadbed across 1,000 miles of mountains, plains, and desert. They laid over 1,700 miles of track, and they connected a nation. The cost was over 1,500 lives. The legacy is the railroad, and the lesson, if there is one, is that the infrastructure we depend on, the systems we take for granted, were built by people whose names we don't know, doing work we can barely imagine, for wages that barely kept them alive. They built America with shovels and hand drills and their own two hands, and they did it without machines.